let me introduce our guest for this evening, Joy Ladin, who's the Gottsman Chair in English at Yeshiva University, where she became the first openly transgender employee of an Orthodox Jewish institution. She earned her BA degree from Sarah Lawrence College, a Master in Fine Arts in Creative Writing from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, a PhD from Princeton University. Joy has twice been honored with the Forward Fives Award, an American Council of Learned Societies Fellowship, a Fulbright Scholarship, among other honors. She is a nationally recognized speaker on gender and Jewish identity. Joy is the author of a memoir of gender transition, Through the Door of Life, which is a National Jewish Book Award finalist. I read a lot of trans biographies, and this is by far one of the best. So a shameless plug for you, Joy. You will, if our audience has not read this yet, you owe it to yourself. It's a great story of triumph and love. She's also the author of the first book-length work of Jewish trans theology, The Soul of the Stranger, God and Torah from a Transgender Perspective, which is a Lambda Literary and Triangle Award finalist. She's also authored 9 books of poetry, including the Book of Anno, which has just recently been reissued. Episodes of her online conversation series called Containing Multitudes are available at jewishlive.org/multitudes. Her writing is also available at joyladin.wordpress.com. So welcome, Joy Ladin.
Thank you so much, Sandy. I'm really glad to be here. I'm so grateful to you for reaching out. I was delighted when I got your email invitation to do this. We spent a long time setting it up and making it happen. I feel like we overcame obstacles. Really, you overcame obstacles. I just said, yes, that sounds good. But I'm really glad to be here with everybody. And I was also very happy that you said that you thought that this would be a subject of interest to your community. So one of the many ways that trans and non-binary people often struggle is because one of the both secular people and traditionally religious people tend to think of trans and non-binary identities as inherently secular. And there are historical reasons for that have to do with, when people started becoming aware of them. I think that there are cultural reasons which have to do with the fact that trans and non-binary identities, by definition, you're not doing what you were assigned to do at birth. You're not doing what your family, I don't know any family that says, remember, when you grow up, I want you to be a good little trans person. Right. No, nobody tells us that they want us to grow up or be trans or non-binary. They may well accept us or they may not, but in order to assert a trans or non-binary identity, you need to be doing that as an individual. And as an individual who's doing something that the culture that you grow up in doesn't expect, doesn't value, doesn't reward. So individualism of that sort is associated with capitalism and secular society, American society that says, we are what we make ourselves. These are sort of long-standing ideas in American society, and so it's often assumed on the other side that that religious community and religious tradition are either inimical to trans and non-binary people, trans and non-binary identities, right? Because secular and traditionally religious don't mix very well at all, right? As in any binary, these are seen as mutually exclusive opposites, where you're either secular or you're traditionally religious. And also because, as I learned from teaching at Yeshiva University, which is an Orthodox school, in traditional communities, both religious and non-religious, one of the things that is a characteristic of traditional communities, I didn't grow up in one, so I had to learn this from my students, is that your identity is defined from the outside in, not from the inside out. So American society in general may say, um, every person has to make themselves, you succeed or fail on your own merits and everything. But many of us grow up in communities and in families and in cultures that say the opposite, that say, we expect you to be a certain kind of person. You have a certain role in our family, you have a certain role in your community, in this religious tradition. Like I didn't even grow up in a very religious, my family wasn't religious at all, but they certainly expected me as a Jewish American after the Holocaust, you're supposed to continue, carry on Jewish identity in the future. And not even for religious reasons, but that was one of the, American society said, follow your dreams, be who you want to be, right? But the Jewish traditional culture says, yeah, about that. First, make sure you stay Jewish, your kids are Jewish. Then, if you have time left over, maybe you can follow your dreams or whatever, right? So that's kind of the way traditional cultures and conservatives, small c conservatives, not about politics here, cultures work. They say first, people are defined by who we are to other people, by the people around us. And secondly, within that, we figure out who we are in ourselves. Whereas individualist culture says, first, you have to figure out who you are in yourself and be true to yourself. And then on the basis of that, you create relations with other people. If there are any fans of Jane Austen or other romance fiction, is a very familiar way of thinking about this, right? So in American individualist society, you're supposed to marry the person you fall in love with and who falls in love with you. It's an individual thing. Whereas many of my students, they went to matchmakers. They participated in a culture where um, arranged marriage is not uncommon, but also, even if it wasn't an arranged marriage, Thursday nights are date nights. And the women from the women's college where I taught get together with a guy from the men's college, and you have a maximum of 3 dates. And at the end of 3 dates, you either get a proposal of marriage that you accept or you stop seeing the person. Yeah, so that that was a trip for me. It's not that they're not also aware of falling in love and these other kinds of values, but I could see that these are really diametrically opposed. Marrying the person that your family thinks is a good person for you to marry, and then they're taught, yeah, you'll love that person later. First, you marry the right person as far as the culture and family is concerned. And then once you're married, you as individuals form a bond that'll last your whole lives. Quite the opposite of what you get from secular society. So we have this kind of binary, which I've been furiously reinforcing in preparation to say, this is not true, at least as far as the association of trans and non-binary identities as inherently secular and incompatible with participation in religious traditions. No binaries are actually true. They're always oversimplifications. But when it comes to trans people and non-binary people trying to figure out where they stand in relation to religious traditions, many of them face, because of this binary idea, face a very painful choice. A lot of the LGBTQ world is militantly secular um, because of there. So many people have had terrible experiences with religion and religious traditions, and the others tend to be reflexively contemptuous of traditional religions. So you can, when I go to LGBTQ conferences and everything, I know that if I come out as a religious person, people actually, I had somebody say, "Oh, and I thought you were intelligent," after I came out. Yes, right. So, and indeed, from the perspective of, well, if you identify with religion, then you're identifying with a culture or a way of thinking that hates you or negates you. Why would you do that? I thought, or. all about being yourself, right? That's the secular thing. On the other hand, if I go to, like my school, and I present myself as a trans person, as you might imagine, they're not hanging out the welcome sign for trans and non-binary people in Orthodox Jewish communities either. So that fact hides another fact, which is that there are many, many trans and non-binary people who are deeply religious and deeply attached to traditional religion, um, and often are told and believe that they have to make painful choices. Either they have to cut off parts of themselves or hide parts of themselves to fit into traditional religious traditions and communities based on religious traditions, or they have to leave behind the parts of themselves that are deeply attached to religions in order to fully embrace their trans or non-binary identities. And from, I went along with this idea reflexively. I grew up in the sort of secular Jewish side of things. And it wasn't until I met Orthodox Jewish trans people who were living in hiding that I realized that I was just wrong about this. Like somebody was on a listserv complaining, um, I'll never find a husband, because I'm a trans woman in an ultra Orthodox community, a tiny ultra Orthodox community. I'll never find a husband. And I wanted to say, well, just leave. Right. You will never find a husband there. So just go. And then I read the next paragraph, which is, of course, I know I could leave, but this is the place where I feel I can really serve God the way I need to serve God. And then sort of the light bulb went on, and I was like, right, it's not that one part of this person is more important than the other part. Not, the trans identity is not more true or real important than the religious identity or identification. She just wants to be a whole person. Why should she have to cut off one part of herself in order to be another part of herself? And once I started realizing that, I realized that my own relation to religious tradition, which I'd always thought of as purely idiosyncratic, just my strangeness, um, actually might be more relevant to other people than I had thought. And so that's what I'd like to um, talk about now, is a way of thinking about relating to religious tradition that doesn't say, all right, religious traditions by definition are over here. Trans and non-binary people are outside them. We either have to hack our ways in, or we have to hide in the back and pretend we aren't there, but one way or the other, they're not ours, and we don't really belong there. And I want to see if I can erase that idea and start with from another place, which just says all religions pretend, at least, that they're for people who are human, that they refer to the entire human experience, right? Very few religions. I mean, some of them have membership qualifications, but once you're a member, they're like, if you're born Jewish, then we're your religion. With 3,000 years of Judaism. So what if we forget the idea that there is some divide built in between trans and non-binary people in religious traditions, and say instead that since religious traditions um, aspire to speak to all of the human experience and all of humanity, that they must include us also, because we are part of the human experience and part of humanity. How do these traditions look if we put our experience center and assume that the traditions are there for us, not only to enjoy, but also to contribute to, right? So I got to that, though, as I say, um, in a roundabout sort of way. So I've always been a religious person, but I was blessed by not growing up in a religious family. Um, If my family had been religious, I have no doubt that I would have been told that all of my ideas about God, Judaism, the Bible, everything were wrong. However, as it turned out, I was the only religious person in my immediate vicinity, so nobody corrected my ideas. Um, it is quite common for children. I think it's natural for children to have what we would call spiritual or religious experiences. I think it's common for most human beings. Different cultures interpret those experiences in different ways. My culture didn't interpret my experiences at all. So I strongly felt that God was present. I've talked to a lot of other trans people who say that when they were children, they also had this strong sense of God as being present and that they were interacting with God. I think that in addition to the fact that I think human beings have that it's natural for human beings to have these kinds of experiences, I think that people who are marginalized or feel lonely or isolated often have these experiences more intensely, not necessarily because we're more spiritually evolved or gifted. I certainly wasn't as a kid. I was a jerk, but because people are always more interesting than God, basically. You know, if I had been able to really feel that I was who I was and enjoy being in my body and feel that when people saw me, they were really seeing me, I think I would have had the same experiences, but I wouldn't have paid as much attention to them because I would have been much more involved with other people. Instead, when I was with other people, I always felt like I was invisible and misunderstood. I felt that my parents, for example, preferred the image that they had of me to the actual me, that if they knew who I actually was, that they would have nothing to do with me. That was best case scenario. I think that they would have nothing to do with me. I know other people have had this experience also. And so the only person that I had to talk to who actually knew who I was God, was this presence of God. And there was, so if you're a kid and God is your closest friend, that is a drag in many ways. God doesn't, play with trucks. God is not interested in reading magazines with you. I mean, really, God is no fun at all. However, God had two enormous advantages to me as a companion. One is when I said to, like my mother, I said, I want some milk. I knew that I was both telling the truth, I did want milk, and I was also lying because she would mistake what I meant by I for the boy that she thought I was. And I knew that I was letting her make that mistake. God was the only person that I would talk to where I knew that when I said I, God knew exactly who I meant. And God also had the advantage of being the being who had put me in this situation. It's common for young children to feel that, have a kind of magical relation to reality. We think anything might happen. Um, you could magically wake up in the body that you want to have, right? Um, and but if you're a religious person, then and you're hanging out with God, then in a certain way, that childlike wish gets attached to something else, which is like, I had a very strong sense that I was created. In fact, I felt a little, I internalized a lot of transphobia, of course, but I also felt a little bit superior. It's like everybody else just rolled off the assembly line. They were just, male and female, male and female, male and female. But I clearly had been put together by hand. I didn't think I had been put together very well, but I was darn sure that I had been created by God. And I was also equally sure that God could change me, could help me out of this terrible situation that God had put me into. But even though God never delivered on that feeling that I was created, gave me something that I think really helped me stay alive through the suicide attempts and depressions, very common, because I felt like I had been created sort of this mismatched toy, part of one toy and part of another put together. I felt like somebody wanted me to be who I was. You know, my family didn't want me to be who I really was. My culture didn't even have a name for who I really was. But God had deliberately created me as I was, when it would have been so much easier to let me be just a boy or a girl like the others around me. So I had this very intense one-to-one personal relationship with God in a family where nobody ever talked about God. To this day, I have no idea if anybody else in my family um, had this sort of experience or even believes in God. And my family did tell me that I was Jewish, but that was a cultural thing. But the cultural thing led my mother to have me go to Hebrew school and synagogue. And that led me to start reading the Bible. As you might imagine, Jews are not crazy about the term Old Testament. So we would say Hebrew Bible or Torah, yes. And if you must say like the New Testament and I personally prefer the mature Testament rather than the Old Testament. Um,
I'll have to remember that one.
yes, I'm hoping it goes viral. I'm not sure any other Jew wants you to call it that, so you can blame me. Mm. Um, so I started reading the Hebrew Bible, and I was riveted. It was a terrible translation. This is a famously bad 1917 translation full of these and thous, and not King James English either. It wasn't beautiful. It was just old-fashioned. But I was riveted because it seemed to me that this book was all about somebody like me. And it was the first thing that I'd seen that was about somebody like me. It was about somebody who doesn't have a body, who doesn't fit into human categories, and who therefore can't be recognized by human beings. And this person, like me, loved human beings and wanted to be with them, and was constantly being forgotten and overlooked and misunderstood and offended and taken for granted. And of course, I'm talking about God. So again, being a young child, it didn't feel to me like a stretch to say, oh, I'm like God, or rather God's like me, right? Let's be clear who's resembling who here. But later when I grew up, there was something about it that stayed with me, not that I in my essence as a human being was like God, although theologically you can, go there, but really that God's social situation and my social situation had a lot in common. Because the truth was, in my family, in my community, as far as I knew, I was the only person who was talking to God, but I knew God was there. So if I'm the only person who's talking to God and saying, God, I know you're there, and God is the only person talking to me and saying, God knows that I'm there, it felt like we had this secret bond. In fact, I never felt that connected. As a Jew, you're supposed to feel connected to other Jews, and I never did. I always felt, because of growing up and hiding, assuming I'm being rejected, I never felt that kind of connection. But instead, I felt like I had this deal with God, which is, I'll know that you're there as long as you know that I'm there, and that we would do this for one another. And when I grew up, so when I was a kid, of course, this was an enormous survival strategy. Strategy makes it too conscious, but I think trans and non-binary kids, even today, rarely grow up in a culture that values us. My son came out to me as trans a couple of years ago. He didn't come out to me assuming that I would say, congratulations, I am so delighted that you've outgrown that, stupid assigned gender identity and come, right? He knew I wasn't going to do that. And I should have done that. But no, he expected me to have the kind of tangled reactions that parents have when we turn out differently than what they believed we were. I plead guilty to all of the things you're imagining. Yeah, that was me. The only difference was he made it clear that I better keep my reactions to myself and just pretend to be cool. So I did. So I'm working to live up to him. But this relationship with God gave me a feeling of being valued and being intended and having a purpose and not being alone, and not being the only one in my condition. And when when people feel invisible, marginalized, that is a low status condition, right? That's you know we, particularly American culture, the more in the public eye you are, the more of a person you're supposed to be, right? We equate fame and celebrity with this magnification of the ego, and so the converse of that is if you're a trans or non-binary person living in hiding your true self, nobody ever sees you, and we often, I think, feel terribly devalued, unvalued, unwanted. I know that I put off transition for years because I assumed nobody would want to see me. But feeling that I had this in common with God, that both God and I were invisible, that kind of changed the whole status calculation, right? So if suddenly being invisible was what the cool kids were doing. And actually, that is the major premise for me of approaching traditional religions and reading the Bible from a trans and non-binary perspective. That's actually the starting point. The cool kids actually, in terms of the Bible and religious traditions, the coolest kid is God. And God doesn't fit into human categories. God doesn't have a body that perfectly expresses God. And I know that for Christianity sort of gets around this question with Jesus. However, if you look at Jesus and see a human being, then as I understand it, of course, I'm not a Christian, so maybe I'm getting this wrong, but as I understand it, if you look at Jesus and everybody who looked at Jesus and saw just a person, they were not actually seeing the divinity of it. Jesus is God in human drag. There are actually other places in the Bible where God is in human drag also, like Abraham, after Abraham's circumcision, yes, genital surgery, God's presence, they go together in the Hebrew Bible. Abraham gets circumcised. He's elderly. He used a flint knife. He did not have anesthetics or antibiotics, so he's in pain. But being a very nice guy, he's sitting by the side of the road to welcome strangers, and God appears in the guise of three wanderers. And God's human drag is so convincing that Abraham doesn't recognize God. Abraham says, "Oh, let me wash your feet. Let me feed you a morsel," right? Abraham is able to relate to God in all these ways that Abraham can't do when God does appear as God, because you can't offer God food when God is a voice in a dream, or what the other ways that God manifests. So human drag has that advantage. But on the other hand, the more convincingly human God appears, the harder it is to recognize God as God. So that is a problem, also a problem that trans people know well, right? We know what it's like to pass so well as what we aren't, that people can't see who we really are. And I would argue that both of those quintessentially trans experiences, the experience of feeling like, wow, I don't have a body or a social identity that enables me to be recognized and understood by other people in the human world. This world isn't built for somebody like me. That is an experience that we have in common with God. And also the experience of, yeah, I pass so well that people don't see who I really am. And I would say that, I am always happy when I um, pass, right? I go to the supermarket. I don't want people shouting at me, "Hey, trans woman!" Right? I'm very happy that people just take me as somebody who was born and raised female. But after a while, I realized, yeah, but when people see me that way, they're not seeing a huge aspect of my life. If I really want people to see me, they can't just see me as somebody who was born and raised female. I wasn't born and raised female. They have to understand the the queerness, the complexity, the binary busting complexity of all of these different parts of my history and experience. They can see that my gender expression language expresses my female gender identity. They totally see that, but that's not the whole me. So even there, I've realized that's also like a passing experience. It's weird because I'm passing by expressing who I really am. But because in our culture, if you look like this and people read it as a female gender identity, then they erase the possibility that you have these other aspects of your experience. So, Sandy, you are nodding in a very kind and inspiring way, but I just wanted to check in and see, is this making sense?
It is. And, I feel a bit envious because, personally growing up, I did not have that kind of relationship with God. So it's making my mind spin in ways that I've never really looked at that before. Um, I think my thing growing up as a little Roman Catholic kid in the 1950s and 1960s was figuring out how to confess my sins every Saturday to the priest and kind of fit in what being transgressed in the Ten Commandments. And so, like, is it a sin against number 6 or number 8? And so I'm curious about, did you ever share with your parents these conversations you had going with God, or would they have not understood that either?
Oh my God. I had two secrets that I knew that if I expressed them, I would be seen as insane. And one of them was being trans, and the other was talking with God. So, so for me, there was this very weird twinning of being religious and being trans in all, because they were both things that didn't fit into the culture that I grew up in. Of course, if I had grown up in a traditionally religious family, and it sounds like you grew up as much more of a religious person, then I would have had to try to figure myself out in relation to religious tradition. But instead, I did the opposite. And this is why I always thought this was too weird to be useful to other people. Instead of figuring out how I fit into Judaism, which of the commandments was I violating, right? Looking, because even that, painful as it is, that's a way of connecting yourself to tradition. Well, do you hate me for this reason or that reason or the other? Like, what should I be feeling guilty about here? Why would you do that to yourself? Because you want to be part of that tradition and community. It matters to you. But I didn't have a tradition that I had to fit myself into. So instead, I created a Judaism that fit me rather than trying to fit myself into a pre-existing Judaism. So that has, like everything else in this world, advantages and disadvantages. There's literally nobody else who's Jewish in quite the way that I'm Jewish. But my Judaism really fits my trans experience very, very well. And it affirms the value of it. It doesn't ever require me to trash it or devalue it or feel guilty about it. And I do think that this core insight that if we imagine a God who is a living presence in the world, and there are other ways to imagine divinity, but in Jewish tradition, Christian tradition, the little bit that I have heard about Muslim tradition, because they're all growing out of the Hebrew Bible, which presents a God who is totally not human, but who is very interested in being present in human lives and human communities. That means that trans and non-binary experience is profoundly related to the way our religious tradition imagines the divine human encounter, because it constantly presents God as somebody who is struggling to be recognized and understood without having to pass, without having to disappear and pretend to be human. And God doesn't even want to pretend to be a normal Iron Age deity. You know, everybody's life would have been easier if God just said, oh, you know what? You want an idol? Go ahead, make an idol. What the heck? You know, knock yourselves out, kids. But no, God doesn't want that. God is like, no, I want you to recognize me as something that you can't um, ever comprehend. And then I'll know that you're really relating to me. And to me, that's very much like when trans people who don't fit, or non-binary people, say, look, I want you to love me as somebody who doesn't fit into these gender categories. Or even, yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Some questions are coming in.
Yeah,
Are you ready?
absolutely.
All right. One of them asks, can you address Deuteronomy 22:5?
I am guessing that that is the prohibition against cross-dressing. Is that right? Um, Asta, am I right about that? I am not one of these people who's memorized the entire Bible. Um, so if I'm
Yes.
right, yes, okay, good. So that's a verse, and it's important to me that it's spoken in Moses's voice, not God's voice. Where Moses is saying, Deuteronomy is all in Moses's voice. It's the only book of the 5 books of Moses that is in the voice of a human being. Most of them are, there's like objective narrator, and then there's different characters, including God. But Deuteronomy is just Moses talking. So Moses says, a woman shall not put on the garments of a man, and a man shall not put on the garments of a woman. Whoever does so is abhorrent to the Lord your God. And Hebrew scholars have a lot to say about the rather confusing verb that is translated as abhorrent or something like that. But I certainly got it in that translation, and I thought a lot about it when I was a kid. And I read the comment, you know, I was a nerd, a Bible nerd. So I read the commentaries, and some of the commentaries said, this is a weird commandment. It doesn't have a punishment attached to it, for example. Right? So there are a lot of other commandments. They say, if you do this, this will happen to you. You'll be exiled, shunned by the community, or you'll be fined. You have to bring a sin offering, whatever it is. This doesn't specify anything. So it doesn't say that people who cross-dress have to be drummed out of the community. It doesn't even say that if you're a priest and you cross-dress, you should be drummed out of the community. It just says you're abhorrent to God. So this is about between you and God. And the theory is that that's because Canaanite religious practices sometimes included sexuality, which is a very powerful force in human life. So they would incorporate sexual practices into their worship practices, and a number of them were prohibited. But as it came to me as a little, trans kid who was cross-dressing, I did feel tortured by this, but complicated ways. So I thought, well, am I a boy dressing in girls' clothing? Or am I a girl who usually dresses in boys' clothing? Is there a way for me not to be screwed by this commandment? And so, weirdly enough, I felt like, wow, if God is here abhorring me for the clothing that I'm putting on, that is a very intensely personal relation to God. God really is present and cares. There's like, one of the things about, for a lot of, I think, Americans, any idea we have of God is of a tremendously distant God. You'd have to really work to get God's attention. And this was saying to me that when I'm all alone in the house, God is there abhorring me. And so there was a way in which I never was positive that this applied to me. I wasn't sure that it didn't apply to other people. It said man and woman, and I was a child. And, there's, the laws in the Bible are like laws in secular culture. As anybody who's ever had a lawyer knows, you don't go to court and the judge says, yeah, you don't need a lawyer. The law just says blah, 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 therefore blah, blah, blah. No, the law is then it's interpreted and it's fought over and how's it applied and all this kind of stuff. It's the same in Jewish tradition. But in fact, Jewish tradition mostly has not interpreted it as being about trans identity at all. One of the explanations was that it was about just being deceptive. You shouldn't pretend to be somebody you're not. So trans people, if you're doing it to express yourself, you're not doing it to be deceptive. And another major thinking is that this is like it was not a sexual practice, but a way of getting in to, these were same-sex homosocial environments. Women and men were largely segregated. So cross-dressing would be a way that somebody who was male could go enter women's areas or vice versa. And so some of the commentaries say that, more contemporary Orthodox Jews needed to learn how to hate trans people because there was no mention of trans people in Orthodox tradition. So, I think trans people have been on the cutting edge of interpreting that verse as being about us, but it didn't occur to people before then. I noticed Panina was asking about feeling loved. I don't know that I could really say that. And I think that I never doubted that God was there with me and involved with me and in an intimate relationship with me. But the problem was I didn't ever feel that I was loved. And, partly that's because there was abuse in my family. And partly it was because I knew that I wasn't the child. When my mother said, I love you, which is not that common, but whenever she said, I love you, I knew she wasn't talking about me because she had never seen me. She'd seen this boy. So, whoever she loved, it couldn't be me because she didn't know who I was. So when I entered into relationship with God, I didn't bring an understanding of what it was to be loved. I don't think I could imagine being loved. It was much easier for me to imagine being abhorred by God. And as a child, when you're isolated, when you're alone and starved for attention, it's better to be abhorred than, there are a lot of kids who get in trouble at school because it's better to get that kind of attention than to get no attention at all. But it took me, actually, it still blows my mind, the kind of love that comes from God is, I remember when I saw the movie Casablanca, and this is how old I am. I love the movie Casablanca. There's a scene where Peter Lorre is sitting down with Rick, Humphrey Bogart, the coolest man during World War II. It was apparently Humphrey Bogart in this cafe. And Peter Lorre says, "You despise me, don't you, Rick?" And Humphrey Bogart says, "Well, I would if I gave any thought to you." And I think that was kind of the way I figured God would feel about me. Like, if God really gave much thought to me, God would probably despise me. And as an adult, I've realized that feeling was because I just didn't know how to imagine that somebody else loved me.
So in other words, by the way, you do a great Peter Lorre. That's just amazing. It brings up if God creates us, whoops, we have a little kitty visiting.
Oh,
this is Annie. She's part of the team here.
Annie.
So we're given this set of circumstances in our life to deal with, and I think do we offend God by transitioning, or do we offend God by not transitioning and not dealing with it? So, it really boils down to that, I think.
I don't have a general truth to offer about this. But I have a couple of anecdotal things that might be helpful for people who are dealing with this. I mean, one is obviously we didn't create ourselves. So whatever we are and whatever we do with what we are, we were made. As a religious person, I feel that we were each made as we are, and so whatever we do with what we're given, there's a way in which all of us was intended when we were created. And so that's one piece of it. Another piece is, I remember for a long time, I just wanted to transition and I was terrified of transitioning. And then when we started having children, I felt that God was okay with that and just not that interested. In general, I don't think God is that interested in gender. I remember when I was being tortured over transition and I was stalking the message boards, an older trans person, I said, what do people do in response? And he said, most people have things that are more important to them than your gender. And I also think that God, what with ruling the universe and all that stuff, has more important things to worry about than my gender. I do think that God is concerned about whether we are loving, whether we're honest, whether we're authentic, whether we're present, whether we're compassionate, whether we're responsive, whether we're taking responsibility for the world we live in. And I know that for me personally, I couldn't be any of those things when I wasn't living as myself. So I can't answer. I don't know if God would have been like, well, transition or not. Maybe if I could have done all those things without that transitioning, maybe God would have been just fine with it. But I felt that at a certain point, I felt like God really was not approving of my transitioning. And I've come to think in retrospect, that was because I needed to have the children that I had. I was not somebody who wanted to have children, particularly started having them. And then after our youngest was born, I felt like God was like, yeah, whatever, if you want to go, but I was talking to a Hasidic rabbi, if you can imagine, so ultra-Orthodox rabbi, who was very, very interested in gender transition. And when I finished, he said, my religious tradition believes that God values authenticity deeply. And I see you doing this as being the work of a master of authenticity. So he felt that, and this kind of relates to Corinne's question about non-binary. So non-binary, I don't identify as non-binary. I don't even know if people who identify as non-binary all are identifying in the same way, or they're just saying, gang, whoever I am, you're not going to figure it out by looking at gender binary categories. So I really can't speak to that. But I do feel that one thing that is in common is that, like trans people who do identify within the binary, non-binary people, I think, are saying, I want to be recognized as more of who I am than will happen if I just allow the normal gender binary conventions to operate on me. Like when I said to my mother, I want some milk, and I knew she would think, oh, the little boy wants some milk. Right. And so that's a way that I think trans and non-binary people have in common. Both of us have to assert ourselves. We have to do something to keep other people from just projecting onto us the automatic interpretations that go along with binary gender. And I don't think that those interpretational habits are evil. I think it's just, human beings always round up to 100. Oh, 93 out of 100 times this happens. So we just say it always happens.
So Joy, let me pose a question then that kind of plays into this idea. How do we work around the fact that as moral people of God, we try not to hurt other people, and yet in the process of transitioning, hurt to other people sometimes? How do we wrap ourselves around that? Do we just acknowledge that, yeah, I kind of hurt you and I'm sorry, and move on? Or that's always, I think, troubled a lot of trans folks.
Yeah. I have a couple of different answers. And of course, you read my books, I was really tortured by that. Mm-hmm. And because there's nothing about, let me back up. If you if you're a non-trans woman or non-trans man, then you grow up, for better and worse, with a whole lot of moral values being put on your gender. There are ideas about what it means to be a good woman and a good man. Different cultures have different ideas about what it means to be a good woman and a good man, and what you have to do for other people and expect. Women tend to get really screwed by those values, but I think in a lot of times men get screwed by those values also. But gender carries some kind of value system that say, we expect boys to grow up into men. Man up, we say, right? We say, it's time to stop acting like a little girl and start, acting like a grown woman, right? But we don't have those imperatives when it comes to trans identity. We don't know the difference between being a good trans person or a bad trans person. When are you supposed to transition? We know about when people are supposed to stop being boys and girls and start being men and women. Well, when is a trans and non-binary person supposed to start coming out into their full trans and non-binariness, right? What's the right way to do it? What's the wrong way to do it? The culture doesn't tell us anything about that. In general, mostly folks just don't want us to do that because we're loved as people who are believed to fit into the gender binary slots that we're assigned. And as my son knew when he came out to me, he knew that I loved him as the girl that I had always assumed he was, and that I was going to have feelings about this changing. Heck, I'm mad at my mother for getting old. It's not her fault. But she is really different from the mother I knew decades ago. It happens. So I think that it is very hard for trans people. And I think just like you trying to figure out what commandment you were violating, I think to some extent I tortured myself over transition just because I wanted to be a good person. And I'd always tried. I knew how to be a good husband. I knew how to be a good father. I knew that transitioning meant not being a good husband or father in, according to normal standards. But there was nothing in my culture that told me what it was to be a good trans person. So we have to make that up for ourselves. And one of my friends who helped me through said, look, people always hurt other people. And that's true. And there is nothing in religion that says never hurt anybody else. There are a lot, that would be a stupid, none of the 10 commandments say thou shalt not hurt somebody else's feelings. In fact, God and even Jesus, they go around hurting people's feelings all the time. So, but the reality is that people are easily hurt. When we love people, we tend to love outmoded versions of them. Everybody is more complicated than we know them as being. Everybody is changing all the time, and so the thing is more like what you're saying, which is, can we do what we need to do be ourselves in ways where we stay aware of and compassionate about and responsive to the hurt that other people are feeling. And we do this in other ways, a parent who says, I know that you're going into your senior year in high school, but we have to move. I have to take this job. Otherwise, we're not going to have food on the table. You're going to hurt your kid. when you say that. You know that that is an unwelcome change, but it's part of life. So you can try to be really with your child in that pain and everything, but you can't create a terrarium where everything always stays the way each person wants it to be. Nobody is like that, and trans people shouldn't have to be like that. We're not different in changing and growing. We're not different in coming out. Everybody comes out. My Orthodox Jewish students, the most conventional ones, they would tell me that they would have problems. Like sometimes their problem was that they were coming out to their family as being more religious than their family was. And their families were not happy about this. They also weren't happy when they came out as being less religious. Some of them were terrified that their parents would discover that they were taking English classes. Right? So, we're not the only ones who do this.
A good perspective. Thank you. Quote of the night: God and Jesus hurt people's feelings all the time. Do we have any other questions? We're coming up on sort of the end of our time, I think. I'm kind of watching the chat. Joy, you can see the chat.
Let's see. If there are no other questions, I just want to throw out one other. Okay, Leviticus 18:22. You know what? I am going to outsource that one because it's a whole other kettle of fish, but there's an entire book about that verse that is a great plain language book written by Rabbi Steve Greenberg called Wrestling with God and Man. It's all about that verse. It's the history of how it's been translated by different cultures and in very different translations at different times. And Steve is the first openly gay Orthodox rabbi who didn't leave Orthodoxy. So I strongly recommend that book. The other thing that I just want to say is that if you read the Bible, you will see that, and here this is the New Old Testament, as you would call it, and the New Testament, both. The stories that you read about are rarely those of people who simply do fulfill the expectation of the gender roles they were assigned at birth. We mostly don't hear about those people. We don't hear anything about Abraham's life until he's an old man with a father who is well over 100, and he's the firstborn son. So he was born as a firstborn son. It's his job to be with his father as long as his father lives and then take over his father's place. And instead, God says to him, leave your father's house, leave your land, leave everything you know, and go somewhere. I'll let you know, a place to be announced later. So the beginning of all three of the religions, the Abrahamic religions, we call them, is this moment when God says, I want you to violate the gender role that you were assigned at birth. God takes human gender and uses the violation of it as a way of building this kind of bond with human beings. That happens over and over again. Jesus at birth was not assigned to be God. Right? They said it's a boy, it's a carpenter, it's a future carpenter, a nice Jewish boy who went into his father's business, as the old joke goes. But the Bible over and over again shows religious relationship with God as requiring us to leave the roles that we've been assigned, because human culture doesn't ever account for God. And so that is a way in which trans experience and non-binary experience, I'm not saying it's inherently religious, because you don't have to be religious to be trans or non-binary, but that is a direct parallel to religious experience. Because when you have these strong relationships with God, you often find yourself being led beyond the bounds of the roles that you were assigned and being what other people you over and over again, you get led into that wilderness to the place you don't know. And I think trans and non-binary people, we should run tour businesses, for those trips. Like, that's our expertise.
Point. On that note, Corinne, do you want to take control and close things out? Or?
Yeah, so I just want to thank you, Joy. This has been wonderful. And as a person who is a secular humanist, but who also has a liberal arts education and who has studied, many of the world's religions and traditions, this has been wonderful. And I would love to have you come back for a part 2.
Oh, fantastic. That would be great.
Yeah, so hopefully we'll have an opportunity to do that. I will follow up with you via email. But a great talk, and I thank you so much. I thank you not only, for being you, but I thank you for being an advocate and for taking the time to really dig in and put thought behind these issues. So perfect talk. And Sandy, I thank you for being a wonderful moderator. And I do want to also just ask everybody to please check us out on YouTube. So we will have this and all of our other Trans Topics talks are archived on our YouTube channel. And I'm sure if you go back and watch a second time, you will find that you get additional value out of it. So with that, I will say thank you so very much, honestly, and have a great night, everybody.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Sandy. Thank you, Corinne.
Thank you, Corinne.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.